Programs and Chief Operating Officer. They're both in Chicago. But first, we're hearing from Don Jodry, our Director of Federal Relations in Washington, D.C. Don, please take it away.
Thanks, Don, and also appreciate everybody joining today's webinar. We really appreciate your attending. In terms of the 2024 elections, I think everybody realizes that we have a Republican executive branch as well as legislative branch, so we'll have unified government, which is a change from the last couple of years. Despite that, we do have relatively narrow margins of Republican control in the legislative branch. In the House, we have 220 Republicans and 215 Democrats. And in the Senate, we have 53 Republicans and 47 Democrats. The Great Lakes delegations in the House and Senate comprises 130 members, and it's pretty evenly split between the two parties. And Great Lakes members are represented on the committees on appropriations in the House and Senate, as well as the committees of jurisdiction over legislative matters, such as the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee and the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. So we have a pretty even split between Republicans and Democrats in the Great Lakes delegation. In terms of policies from the Trump administration, things that we sort of are expecting to see are kind of like what we saw in Trump's first term. We expect rollbacks in the area of environmental law in terms of regulations. In the first Trump term, there were over 100 individual rollbacks of environmental laws. We're expecting to see in the Clean Water Act space regulations that probably narrow the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act in terms of protections for wetlands. We're probably also going to see some regulations that limit the ability of states and tribes to sort of object to projects on water quality certification issues. And we're going to see probably some other things in that area. We also expect the Trump administration to have sort of to not support the environmental justice advancements of the last administration, and also have a more narrow view of climate change. So we expect to see those sorts of things, although nothing specific has occurred yet. In terms of the 2025 roadmap that was released before the election, Project 2025, we do see these themes reflected there, but we also see some support for water infrastructure funding. So that is an area that we think there may be some support for. In terms of funding issues, we expect to see a limitation on federal funding. We're probably going to see a fair amount of proposed cuts to the federal budget in areas that are important for the Great Lakes, particularly in the water space, as well as other areas. We do hope that and expect that the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative will be funded. That's an area that is overwhelmingly supported on a bipartisan basis in the House and Senate. And all the Trump administration in its first term tried to cut the funding for that. That was rejected by the Congress. So expect to see that. And we're also probably going to see a focus on federal staffing and agencies in an effort to sort of decrease the number of federal employees, which would be detrimental for sort of carrying out some of the standard things that are important for the Great Lakes in terms of the environmental area. With respect to people, so far we've got a couple of cabinet appointments that we have seen. We have former Congressman Lee Zeldin has been proposed to be the EPA administrator. We know that when he was a congressman, he was supportive of the Long Island Sound restoration, which is a program that's very similar to the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative in terms of providing funding for a local geographic area to support efforts in habitat improvements and water quality and things like that. So we hope that he will be supportive of things like that in the Great Lakes. We do have the nomination of Russell Vought to be the director of OMB. This is, he has a very narrow view of the role of the federal government. He supports deregulation. He also supports reducing federal funding and reducing federal staffing. So we expect to see him having a large influence in the future. That's kind of what we are seeing at the moment. So we know that there will be a lot of things that we'll be reacting to as the Trump administration rolls out programs and policies, and there are going to be also additional sub-cabinet appointments that they'll be making in the next 30 to 60 days, and we'll be able to sort of assess where we are after that. And that's just kind of my sort of quick summary of what we're anticipating from the Trump administration. And I want to turn it over to Molly to talk about a little bit about what we saw with the states in terms of the state elections.
Thanks, Don. Given the situation at the federal level, we think states are going to be really important over the next couple of years. And the good news is we already have staff active in Ohio, Michigan, Minnesota, Illinois, and Washington, D.C., and we're also doing work in Wisconsin. So we're prepared to pivot to pay more attention to states where we think we're going to have opportunities to work on our priorities that we might not be able to make progress on at the federal level. So what changes did we see in the states this election? Michigan's House flipped from Democrat-controlled to Republican-controlled. This ends Michigan's Democrat trifecta of controlling the House, Senate, and the governor's office. But Michigan is the Great Lakes state, and both parties have a strong affinity for the Great Lakes. The Minnesota House is tied, which will require the parties to share power, and Governor Walz remains the governor of Minnesota. In fact, all of the Great Lakes governors remain the same, except in Indiana, where Mike Braun, who is the new Republican governor, is taking over from Governor Holcomb, also a Republican. Braun is currently a U.S. Senator from Indiana. He's a conservationist, has been supportive of the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, has been a member of the Senate Great Lakes Task Force, and was a member of the Senate Climate Solutions Caucus. So he is knowledgeable about the Great Lakes, and he is one of the few Republican senators who has advocated for climate solutions. Most governors have some familiarity with the lakes. I might even argue a lot of familiarity with the lakes, and support efforts to protect and restore the Great Lakes. We've seen this with leadership from Governors Pritzker and Whitmer on keeping invasive carp out of the Great Lakes. Governor Evers is the past chair of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Governors and Premiers. That's an organization of, you guessed it, the Great Lakes Governors and Premiers, and it helps advance the their Great Lakes priorities. Governor Whitmer is the current chair of that group, and Governor DeWine from Ohio is the vice chair. Governor Walz has personally attended gatherings of the group in the past, and all eyes will be on Quebec this fall when the governors and premiers are set to meet again. Governor DeWine has also been a champion of funding to reduce polluted agricultural runoff to Lake Erie. So again, a number of governors with a lot of familiarity and a lot of support for the Great Lakes. We're anticipating coordination among Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Michigan governors and attorneys general, also possibly New York, all Democrat, but the specific responses from those states are largely going to depend on the state priorities and White House action. So we'll be keeping an eye on that. We anticipate that the Ohio governor and attorney general might collaborate on parts of the White House deregulatory agenda, but Ohio Governor DeWine is a supporter of federal Great Lakes programs and spending, and as a former U.S. Senator, he knows these issues really well. We think there's an opportunity to lean into some Great Lakes regional bodies over the next couple of years. There's the Great Lakes Commission. Ohio is the current chair, and Pennsylvania is the vice chair. The Great Lakes Commission's members are Great Lakes states and provinces, and they work together to address issues across the region and to balance the use and conservation of the Great Lakes. I already mentioned the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Governors and Premiers. There's the Great Lakes Legislative Caucus. It's a bipartisan group of state and provincial legislators that are working to address Great Lakes issues in their jurisdictions. And then there's the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Cities Initiative. It has a membership of more than 240 local elected officials from Great Lakes communities on both sides of the border, working on Great Lakes protection and restoration. We have relationships with all of these groups and will continue working with them where opportunities and priorities align. So you may be wondering what's possible at the state level in the coming years. There are probably a lot of things, but here's just a few examples. We think we may be able to make progress on plastic pollution policy in Illinois and Michigan. Each state is going to be implementing water infrastructure programs because federal funding will continue to flow to the states for drinking water and wastewater treatment upgrades. Each state also has a role to play in implementing the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative projects. Agricultural spending and policies are likely to be on the agenda in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Ohio. So we're expecting a lot of activity in the states, and we're looking forward to working with elected officials across the region on their Great Lakes priorities. And now I'm going to turn things over to Joel. He's going to share with us where the Alliance is headed over the next couple of years.
All right. Thank you, Molly. Thank you, Don. And thanks everybody for joining today again. I really appreciate you making the time to dig into this with us. As you can imagine, we've been spending a lot of time at the Alliance over the last month, reviewing the election results, thinking about what it means for the Great Lakes and what we can accomplish in the next 2 years. 2 to 4 years. And I think that's a really important way to start to come to the conclusion of this conversation, is that we're focused on what we can do. I recognize that there are going to be a lot of efforts to unpack, undo, roll back regulations and funding that have been beneficial for clean water in the Great Lakes. But I really want to emphasize that our region, and I think you've heard this come through in Don and Molly's comments, our region is starting from a position of strength. We're not fighting back. We are very well positioned to demonstrate how important the Great Lakes are to our region. And we know that time and time again, as long as we stick to the commitments and the goals that we have, we win with water. The Great Lakes come back and we win with water. We win with the Great Lakes. And I think that's going to be the case over the next 2 to 4 years, even though we've got a lot of work in front of us. Great Lakes and clean water issues routinely carry majorities in this region, whether that's public polling or state legislatures that Molly mentioned, or members of Congress that Don mentioned. And we think we have a policy agenda and a program agenda that can move forward regardless of who is in the White House. So I just want to talk a bit about the ways that we're approaching that work over the next couple of years and some do's and don'ts for our advocacy, and then a little bit more about what we're going to be doing as far as the Alliance's capacity and commitments to make sure those things can happen. One thing is that, one of the strengths of the Alliance is our research and analysis and how we communicate that information. So researching and analyzing and communicating the impacts of White House decisions and congressional spending decisions is going to be really critical. When there's a deregulatory effort or a move against scientific integrity, making sure that those are communicated regularly and often and really in the public conversation is going to be critical over the next couple of years. And, we really are going to need to press the administration to honor existing commitments, like the cleanup of the Great Lakes areas of concern, these big polluted hotspots in rivers and harbors across the Great Lakes region that the prior administration had indicated would be largely cleaned up by 2030, making sure that the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative action plan that was just published is implemented to the fullest extent possible. It's not just about, though, communicating the data points and the funding priorities and the regulatory priorities. What we have seen, and I know you all have probably seen this in other issues that you follow, the stories about our region are just so critically important. We have a Great Lakes filled with stories, and stories about the lakes, stories about the people that rely on them every single day in a whole variety of ways. Activating those stories and making sure that they're part of the public conversation is going to be just as critical as communicating the data and the policy details. So when we talk about the impacts of toxic algae blooms on drinking water and people's health, we talk about the impacts of nitrate pollution, going into our groundwater and contaminating our drinking water, the legacy contamination of our rivers and harbors I already mentioned, and lots of other festering issues. These stretch from, the most densely packed city out to the most sparsely populated rural area and everything in between. And it's really going to be critical to constantly be communicating where those outstanding problems are, what we need to do to solve them. And as I mentioned, the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative is part of that. Smart, protective regulation and that takes care of people's health and the environment is going to be part of that. And that work is far from done. Pushing again on something that Molly brought up, we have to have high expectations for all the Great Lakes states, regardless of what party the governor is, or regardless of who's controlling the state legislature. Every Great Lakes state has to be looking at tightening up their own regulations and protections for clean water over the next 2 to 4 years, not just because there are going to be risks on that front coming from the federal side, but because it's the right thing to do for the Great Lakes. And that's something that we're going to be pushing as well. We also have to be making sure that our message is being heard in Washington. That means that, places around the Great Lakes where there are folks in Republican leadership, or there are people that can speak to the administration and members of Congress that'll be heard clearly, is going to be really important, and making sure that we're leveraging those voices across both urban, suburban, and rural areas across the Great Lakes, and making sure those messages get heard by the White House. And then I just want to kind of double up on Molly's point about these regional sort of governance bodies, the Great Lakes Commission, or the governors and premiers, or the legislators. Those networks and those governance bodies, they're emblematic of the Great Lakes region's strength. We are a very well organized region with a lot of organized voices ready to communicate what's most important here. And making sure that those folks are lifting up their voices early and often is going to be especially critical. A couple of don'ts, and I hope you've heard this come through in the way we're talking about the issues. Don't panic. We are coming at this from a position of strength, and we know that we've got support for the Great Lakes on both sides of the aisle in different ways. And we've got to push people on both sides of the aisle to follow through on their commitments, and most importantly, on what the people of the Great Lakes are expecting. I don't think anybody, voted, or I don't think most people voted because they believe that we want to slash environmental spending and roll back regulations that have kept the Great Lakes and our drinking water clean. The other thing is, don't let the, being scared about anti-regulatory or, anti-environmental protection agency rhetoric, carry the day. We have much better stories to tell, much more important stories to tell about the Great Lakes, and more important work to do than to, allow debates about, why regulation is good or bad to carry the day. We know regulation has been a net positive for the Great Lakes because we drink that water every single day, and we've seen the impact of it over 50 years. I want to talk briefly about the Alliance's capacity, and then we're going to open it up to your questions and try to get to as many issues as you want to talk about as we can. The Alliance for the Great Lakes is one group among a whole variety of groups that are working to protect the Great Lakes and clean water across the region, and we work with many of those partners. Right now, the Great Lakes movement that we're part of, it doesn't need to pivot, it needs to grow. Everything that we were working on before the election, issues like the invasive species issues, clean water and drinking water infrastructure restoration, the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, keeping plastic out of our water, stopping agricultural pollution from causing toxic algae blooms. These issues they were there before the election, and they're still there. That work must continue, and we have to keep notching victories and progress on those issues. At the same time, we have to grow to make sure that our region, the Great Lakes, is positioned to be, proactive and responsive to whatever we hear from a new administration and a new Congress. So that means for our part, that's going to mean, taking on some of the strategies I mentioned, but also, adding some capacity. We're going to be adding at least 3 new staff in 2025. We're going to have a full-time person working on agricultural issues. We're going to have a full-time person working on issues around Great Lakes water supply and water use to address some of the changing ways that large-scale water users are coming into our region. And we're going to add at least a couple of staff members working at the state level to drive administrative and legislative advocacy in some of the key states that Molly mentioned, and really grow that capacity. We're spending some of our own assets to do this, funds from our LEBOT strategic fund to make sure that we're meeting the moment here in the Great Lakes region, and we'll be doing as much as we can the more successful we are at fundraising. I'll just take this moment to remind everybody on the call that we are an organization supported by donors, people like you, and so contributions right now help us to grow that capacity and make sure that our state decision makers are hearing those critical messages at a time when some of our clean water is going to be at risk. So with that, I'm going to turn things back over to Don, and I think we're going to open things up for Q&A, and you've got some great expertise here on the call, so I encourage you to ask about what's on your mind, and we'll do our best to respond.
Okay, thanks everyone. Great presentations, and like Joel said, let's put some questions here in the chat, in the Q&A, I'm sorry. Let's see. Tom would like to ask a question, and I don't know if we can answer this one off the top here, but is there a concern, especially federally, that data could be harder to obtain or record keeping could be reduced with projected cuts? Anybody want to field that one? Yeah, I don't think we have a good handle on that yet, but maybe Molly, you want to?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think collecting data, whether it's water quality monitoring or climate data, requires funding. And so if agency funding gets cut at the federal level, that can have an impact on how much monitoring they're doing, what data they're collecting, how they're able to work with that information. And so I do think, there are opportunities in the next Congress for us to see a reduction in the data that's being collected. But there's also an opportunity for Congress to hear from you, from us, that information is really critical. And so, definitely not a foregone conclusion.
Yeah, I want to jump on this one too, because of course you're going to see changes to like federal websites and how information is being communicated under the new administration. Data is sometimes like you're not seen as like the most critical thing, but it is absolutely vital, right? So we're involved in a project right now that's generating a huge amount of data on what's in agricultural runoff in Southeast Michigan, right? And that's been prioritized by the state of Michigan, which is great. Ohio has some great monitoring programs that it's supporting out of state funds. If you start to see an erosion in monitoring, then you're not going to find, you're going to, of course, find fewer problems that are out there in our clean water, right? But that doesn't mean that they're going away. It means that they're not being tracked. And so making sure that funding for that basic science and the basic work that agencies like EPA and NOAA either do directly, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, another critical agency, making sure that that funding is in place, either for scientists to do that monitoring directly, or, as it often is to get those monies out to the states that are actually experiencing those Great Lakes problems on the ground is going to be critical.
Thank you, Joel. Let's see, we got a question here that I can answer. Actually, are we doing any lobbying at the federal level? And we are. Don Jodry, who's in this call, leads all that federal lobbying. Don, if you want to mention anything about that and the work that you do there.
Yes, we do lobby. We lobby both the Congress and the executive branch. I'm based in Washington, D.C., as Don said. And we have a number of federal parties that we are working on actively throughout the year. And we're going to release our federal parties for 2025 in late January. But yes, we do lobby. We also lobby on proposed rule changes. So the answer is yes.
Great. We're getting a lot of questions about state level work, what people can do at the state level, how they can help support us, and what our supporters can do at the state level. Molly, maybe you can answer that first, and then kick it back over to Joel, what our supporters can do.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most critical thing that people can do is be talking to their elected officials, and you would be surprised at how many people don't talk to their elected officials. So whatever issues are important to you related to the Great Lakes, or really related to anything, you should be communicating that to your local, state, federal elected officials. And I saw there was a specific question about Illinois, and I can't help myself because I run our invasive species file here at the Alliance for the Great Lakes. Definitely in Illinois, we want to keep up the support and pressure on the governor's office to keep the Brandon Road project, which is a project to keep invasive carp out of the Great Lakes. We want to keep that project on time and moving forward. And right now we're in a good place, and we want to make sure it stays that way. So if you're in Illinois, please communicate that to the governor's office, and you can communicate it to state legislators as well.
Joel, you want to talk a little bit about our supporters and what they can do to help us at the state level?
I can do that. I'll mention another issue that it kind of depends on where you are. Generally, what Molly said about reaching out to your legislators is critical. I think also having good relationships with local elected officials whose voices are heard in the state capitals is also really effective. And so the more you can do to encourage local, council members, drain commissioners, mayors, whatever it is, to highlight these issues to the state legislators representing those districts, that's a great way of getting that voice heard in the state capitol. Specifically, I want to mention that the states are going to be on the front lines of plastic reduction for the foreseeable future. There are active efforts to get various plastic source reduction policies done in Illinois and Michigan. Fortunately, Minnesota passed a comprehensive package last year or earlier this year, which is fantastic. That issue is one that's going to be really critical to focus on at the state level, as is agriculture. Not that we expected big reforms before the election, but certainly now we don't see any pathway towards addressing the problem of that overwhelming nutrient pollution from ag coming out of DC. And so again, pressing the states who are already active on this issue in different ways, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin in particular is where we're focused, to address ag policy and to address some of the shortcomings of how the states are doing it is going to be really critical.
Great, thanks, Joel. And actually, I want to go back to Joel. Someone has a specific question for you about, let me see here.
If you're talking about Peter's question?
Yes.
Yeah. The big question. So the question is what keeps me up at night, and what's the largest opportunity I want to address that wakes me up early? Well, I don't sleep as much as I should anyway. But I don't think that's all because of work. But okay, so I answered the first part of your question a couple of months ago at an event. The thing that keeps me up at night, honestly, is agriculture. I think that the Great Lakes is on a pathway toward growth in agriculture production and in land that's available for agriculture. The growing seasons are lengthening. And all that means is more demand on water supplies in different ways. And it means more pressure to put more inputs on the land that eventually get washed off into our rivers, streams, and lakes. And I don't see a way that federally we're approaching that problem in any sort of an effective way to really allow the Great Lakes to continue growing agricultural productivity, and at the same time cleaning up this big problem we have where the nutrients are coming from all these different sources and causing blooms the size of half of a Great Lake, for example, in Western Lake Erie, the size of Green Bay. So that's what keeps me up at night. Or one of the things that keeps me up at night. Biggest opportunity, honestly, it is one of the things we've been talking about today is that the Great Lakes states have, and by the way, I and the Alliance team doesn't agree with everything every governor does about the Great Lakes, and we certainly don't disagree with everything every governor does, but there's a really high level of Great Lakes literacy and commitment in different ways at the governor level. And I think that's something that's been true for a while, but we've got to keep educating the governors. We've got to keep them on their toes when it comes to their Great Lakes commitments and really push into that over the next 4 years. Because again, as I said earlier, we're starting from a position of strength, and I think those state executives really have to be in the front when it comes to standing up for the Great Lakes. And so that's the opportunity I see, especially coming up right in front of us to really keep that Great Lakes strength going.
Thank you, Joel. This next one I'm going to kick over to Molly. Tom Henry asks, hello, Tom. If clean water remains a priority, what are some of the other winners and losers in terms of issues? Wetlands, coastal development, air pollution, he asks. And also there's another question here about climate and DEI terms that might get a target or a grant for grants and funding and how those awards are given out. Molly, can you address that?
Yeah, sure. And DEI is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think these questions fit together because I think, it's possible that some of the losers will be climate change related policies and also potentially DEI policies. We have a grant from the EPA's Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, Great Lakes Environmental Justice Grants Program. It's quite a mouthful, and it's to help support projects to reduce flooding and other priority issues in Illinois, the Chicago area, and Northwest Indiana, that's a 6-year grant. And we've been given the first 2 years of funding. So we're going to have to wait and see what happens with the next 4 years of funding for that program. And there are a number of programs that the Biden administration has championed that could be, targets for elimination related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. In terms of like specific issues, like if clean water remains a priority, what else might be a winner or a loser? I definitely think, wetlands was a specific piece of this, and we've seen protections for wetlands shrink at the federal level. That is an opportunity for states to step in. So where the federal government isn't regulating intermittent wetlands, those are wetlands and streams that aren't there all the time, just when it rains a lot. States can step in and regulate those and make sure there are protections. Joel, it looks like you have some other thoughts on this one.
No, I was just going to comment, it's critical to know that there are going to be some big national legal fights, even on clean water issues. I consider wetlands a clean water issue. They provide so many benefits. One of them being, keep cleaning water before it hits our streams and lakes. And so how the protections for wetlands are defined under the Clean Water Act, how states are allowed or not allowed to be involved in protecting their own state's water quality under the Clean Water Act, how EPA prioritizes enforcement actions against industrial polluters, like all those things. There are going to be some big national regulatory fights on those. And so no doubt a lot of the folks on this call have heard predictions about that. And so being aware that those are going to be fought out in federal courts across the and are really issues that affect the entire country is really important.
Thank you, guys. There was a question about, is this being recorded? I can answer that one. Yes. And you'll get an email from me either today or tomorrow with the recording link after this is done. I had one up here in front of me that I like. Hold on here. Let's see. This is good, from Tom Coombs, I believe. How would you rate the general public's common knowledge of being part of the watershed versus living on the Great Lakes?
I'll take that one, or I'll start off on that one, Don. I think it's a good question because there's a difference between sort of people experience the Great Lakes in all sorts of different ways. I live in Chicago. I've been around the Great Lakes my whole life, and I love standing on the shoreline and just looking out over the water, right? It brings something really special to me. But the Great Lakes are also like the end of a watershed. They're where all the stuff that we walk through, cycle through, drive through all the time, where it eventually ends up is all the stuff that comes off that land ends up in our Great Lakes. And that's the watershed part of it. And, what we want to do, I think, is, connect that awe and wonder for the majestic vista of the Great Lakes to the reality that, everything that happens on every square mile, every acre of land is having an impact on the water that inspires that awe and wonder, right? And that connection is really, really important. Tom, you asked about any targeted projects to increase water quality in the watershed. I mentioned this briefly earlier, but earlier this year, we initiated a really high density, kind of intense monitoring program in Southeast Michigan. Southeast Michigan's watershed drains into Lake Erie. And so it's one of the sources of farmland pollution to Lake Erie that causes those toxic algae blooms. So we've got this sort of high density monitoring network going on there to evaluate how land use changes are causing or improving, whether they're improving pollution going into the water, into these ditches and streams, which eventually that's the source of the problem for Lake Erie. And so that's one example. There are lots, I want to emphasize, there are lots of organizations that do similar monitoring and reporting projects across the region. And there's probably a watershed group for every river in the Great Lakes region. And those are really important efforts to support, because when you can tell the story of what's going on in that water locally, and that gets up, if you can get that up to the leadership level in the state legislature or the governor, that's what can start to impact policy changes that actually improve that water.
Thank you, Joel. We have another question from, let's see here. I have new glasses, apologize. Bentley. Bentley asks, do you anticipate working on or studying two emerging issues at the intersection of energy and water, data centers and carbon capture and sequestration/storage, especially the impacts on water and Great Lakes? Or maybe you're already working on those issues. I think Molly, you'd like to take that one?
I can get it started. It looks like Joel has things to say too. So the Alliance has long worked on water use issues through our work on the Great Lakes St. Lawrence River Basin Water Resources Compact. And that prevents most diversions outside of the Great Lakes, but it also does require states to put into place some water withdrawal. I don't know that I would go programs. I don't know I would go so far as to say regulations. Definitely we've seen a lot of higher water users looking to the site in the Great Lakes. Data centers are a great example of that. And so as we're moving into 2025, we're looking to expand our work on water use and to really look at what states are doing and what opportunities exist for states to improve their programs related to water use and to better understand where in the state you can have large water users because there is a lot of water, and where in the state that might not make sense. So yeah, we're looking at growing our water use program. Really, I think this is a really exciting area. I'm really excited about it. Joel, you want to add some?
Yeah, I'll just note that over the last 5 years or so, we've seen an influx not only of data centers, but of IT related manufacturing facilities, aquaculture. So inland, inland aquaculture where fish are grown for market. Changes in, as I mentioned earlier, changes in agricultural practices or agricultural land use. And I think all of those and more are going to be the next frontier of large scale water use here in the Great Lakes. I don't think we're really ready for that, right? And I think that's something that we have to, as Molly said, make sure it's happening in the right place, and that there isn't a gold rush mentality where access to cheap or free water is just assumed. This is a huge asset for our region, and something that the states have to be smart about how we bring businesses into the region and allow businesses to expand, and not just assume that it's there. So yeah, I'm excited about that work, and we'll have more to say about that probably by mid 2025. I know one of our teams is working on it right now. And thanks for mentioning the carbon capture and storage issue, because that's not something I have personally been as connected to, and we'll definitely be looking into that as far as water use.
Thank you, Joel. I got two questions here I'm going to put together. One's from Kimberly. She's wondering if we engage with groups involved in bioregioning, yes, or regenerative agriculture, indigenous knowledge holders or wisdom keepers on both northern and southern shores of the Great Lakes. Another person's asking a question: how is AGL and other Great Lakes orgs collaborating with research groups and academic institutions in terms of monitoring and using their peer-reviewed data and lobbying efforts? So more of a question about how we're working with other groups and what we're doing with other groups. I think Don Jodrell, you might want to take this one.
Sure, thanks, Don. Yes, we do engage with a lot of other groups. I also saw a question asking if the Great Lakes organizations meet together in Washington and lobby together. And so with respect to those three questions, we do collaborate with a lot of other organizations on the specific issue of the traditional knowledge. Yes, there are a number of groups that are part of the Healing Our Waters Coalition. We're a member of that, and we engage with them there. They also engage in Washington, D.C. level advocacy on issues that are important for the Great Lakes. We engage in a number of other caucuses, the Climate Change and Water Equity Caucus, as well as the Clean Water for All Caucus. And all of these groups have the same mission, which is to sort of promote policies that are beneficial for water equity, clean water, and the like. So we do a lot of coordination and collaboration with them, particularly on our advocacy efforts.
Great. Anyone else want to offer anything in that? No? All right.
I mean, I would just say that this is also an area where we are looking to grow over the next several years. We have great partnerships with organizations, academic institutions, really across the region, but there are opportunities to grow new relationships. And so that's something that we're always looking at, but definitely something that we plan to focus on as we're thinking about where we place staff, and the work that they focus on over the next couple of years.
Great. I'm just looking for some more questions here. Let's see. Da, da, da.
I know
All
it's
right.
a little bit of, Don, there's one that I know has come up in a couple of ways so far, but I want to maybe put a finer point on it and ask Don Jodry to speak to this because there are a couple things in here about wetland policy. And, Don, could you comment? I know it's a very, very complicated topic, but could you comment briefly on the recent Supreme Court decision and kind of the implications for the states?
Sure. Well, last year, the court considered a case, Sackett versus EPA, over the scope and jurisdiction of EPA under the Clean Water Act in regulating water and what the reach of the act was. And basically, in a nutshell, it lessened protections for wetlands unless they were immediately adjacent to navigable waters. So this issue came up, last year in the Supreme Court. And what's going to happen as a result of that is the Trump administration is likely to issue a rule that narrows the scope of protections for waters with respect to what waters are regulated by EPA under the Clean Water Act. So we're likely going to see a rule that's going to put in place the holding of the Supreme Court last year. And as Molly said earlier, this makes it more important for states with respect to wetlands protection that states step in and regulate areas that may have been regulated before under federal law, but would no longer have those protections under the Clean Water Act. So that's kind of the short answer, I think, Joel, on that issue.
Thank you, Don, for doing that. Joel, I think this one might be for you. Tom Henry has another question here. Offshore wind power in the Great Lakes region has faced an uncertain future since the end of the Icebreaker project a year ago this month. And he mentions the newly elected president's stance on wind. Can you elaborate about that?
Yeah, and with so many issues flying around, we're trying our best not to try to predict the future and react to everything that could happen. But on offshore wind, Tom, I think it's always been economically tenuous, right? I think that the project that got the furthest along, as you know, was Icebreaker, and that without strong federal support for offshore wind, I think the economic case in the Great Lakes region is really, really tough, based on everything I've seen. And so, I think we've said this in the past that, a pilot program that evaluates like real world evaluation of offshore wind, could work to see if this is something that could be a good fit for the Great Lakes. There's just some stuff you're not going to know, until you're actually evaluating a windmill in the water. And Icebreaker was, that was the path that they were on. But, absent some, significant, government support of a project like that, it's difficult to see how that happens with, just support from the private side. And so I don't think that, offshore wind in the Great Lakes, at least during this administration, is something that's going to have a great chance of happening.
Thank you, Joel. This one might be for you too. Chris asks, what would you recommend to the Ontario provincial or Canadian federal governments in the context of the new administration and the importance of the states that Molly referenced?
Well, Molly, I could answer that, but you have some insights into this because, Molly works with a binational body herself and has some insights into how things are viewed from our friends in Canada.
Yeah. Hi, Chris. I think, some of those bodies that I mentioned are great opportunities to engage with elected officials in the United States and in Canada at the same time. And so I think, the Great Lakes Commission, governors and premiers, really all of them, Legislative Caucus, the Cities Initiative, are all binational or all bipartisan or multi-partisan. And so I think, finding ways to work with those bodies can really help raise issues that are priorities for states, like for the United States and for Canada. Trying to think, an example where Canada has really taken the lead is ballast water. Ballast water is the water that ships discharge into the Great Lakes, and when they take up ballast water, they can take up critters and introduce them into the lakes or move them around. Canada is going to require that every single ship in the Great Lakes treats its ballast water, and the United States is really lagging on that in terms of regulations. And so, I do think there are opportunities for Canada to set an example for us in the United States and for states themselves. So, I do think there are lots of opportunities to work together and hopefully learn from each other.
Thank you, Molly. Tom Henry has another question. How can administration that supports coal-fired power plants, fracking, and drill baby drill for more oil and natural gas be supportive of water quality given how what falls from the sky impacts water quality? And how can administration so adamantly opposed to climate change be supportive of water quality for the same reason?
Well, this gets right at the heart of one of the big challenge that's going to be under this administration. We've got, on the one hand, a popular program like the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative that has broad support. People love seeing the places get cleaned up and seeing fish and wildlife habitat get restored, and parks and green infrastructure and those magnificent vistas that I mentioned earlier. At the same time, some members of the administration, some members of Congress are going to be supporting a deregulatory, reduced enforcement agenda, and supporting further extraction of fossil fuels. I think it's really important that we take everything on its merits. And so the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, which we're hoping gets reauthorized before this current Congress ends, needs to continue. It needs to follow through on the commitments that are made in Great Lakes Action Plan 4, which just came out. And that should be supported, on a bipartisan basis. But it's not enough, right? Just supporting the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, funding it every year, doesn't solve the problem of, the ones you mentioned in your question, Tom, about, the climate impacts of oil extraction and processing, which is the Great Lakes. If you didn't know this, the Great Lakes region, for all of you, is a major global center of oil and fossil fuel processing, as well as steel making. So you have to also support smart regulations and clean water protections on those industries. So we're not spending money on restoration at the same time that we're making problems worse by increasing the amount of pollution going into the water. So yeah, great question. And we're going to be expecting and looking for both the administration and states to take the lead on both sides of that question, and certainly communicating and reviewing when there are lapses, and we expect there will be lapses, and we'll be paying really close attention to that.
Thank you, Joel. I think we have time for two more questions here. Roger asks, I should know this, sorry, but does the Alliance have legal staff like some other environmental focused orgs? Legal battles were mentioned.
Yeah, we have, I can take that. So we have lots of attorneys on our staff, but we don't bring litigation with our staff attorneys in the lead. We partner when we do that, which we do occasionally. We partner with other organizations that have dedicated legal staff who go to court. And that's been a really effective way for us to approach it. Our take on litigation is when it's strategic and really critical for the Great Lakes, and so an issue needs to be covered, we can use that strategy or that approach, the litigation approach, to take it on. That's not something we do frequently, but we're definitely going to be, I guess I can say we'll be looking at all the tools in the toolbox to protect the Great Lakes for the next 4 years, certainly.
Thank you, Joel. Okay, we're going to go with the final question here from Richard. Is AGL working with Department of Agriculture to show farmers ways to reduce nutrient runoff? I think Joel mentioned earlier, and I'll go to Don and Joel this, but I think he mentioned earlier our work with the Michigan Department of Agriculture on a monitoring project, which is really cool, and you can find that on our website. But I'll go to Joel first, and then Don Joddery, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, so we don't do, I also saw another question here related to this, which I'm going to mention, Don. We don't do direct work with farmers, with landowners, or with tenant farmers in the Great Lakes, as much as we are working on state level policy. So for example, I mentioned in Michigan, we're working on that monitoring project. In Ohio, we're working on the state's conservation fund for agriculture, for changing agricultural practices, called H2 Ohio, in addition to advocating for more regulations on farming in Ohio. And that's, we partner with smaller organizations or organizations that are in state that have some of those direct relationships with farmers, and are doing sort of practice education. I also wanted to bring in, though, and then Molly and Don, please comment on this one. Somebody else asked about CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations, which are one major source of nutrient pollution, phosphorus and nitrogen pollution that goes to the Great Lakes. And what's happening on those? I don't think you're going to see a lot of changes federally on that, to the question. But I did want to mention that there is the state of Michigan has moved to improve its CAFO regulations, and that are intended to ultimately reduce the amount of manure of nutrients from manure that flows into surface waters. There has been some movement on that in Michigan. There has not been movement on that in Ohio. And so the states are going to be taking different approaches to that, some worthwhile and some, not making progress and approaching it in a different way. So that's a challenging issue. But yeah, we do absolutely need to stop putting as much both manure and chemical fertilizer on the ground. And if we don't stop doing that, if we don't find a way to reduce that, we are not going to solve the problems like what's plaguing Lake Erie. So, and Molly and Don, I don't know if you had anything to say about that, maybe from the federal side, Don.
The only thing I'll add, that in the last Congress, we have been promoting the concept that we'd like to see investments in conservation funding that address non-point source runoff, targeted to improvements in water quality. And we did work with former Representative Gallagher and Representative Marcy Kaptur on a bipartisan bill, the Healthy Watershed, Healthy Farms bill, to try to address this point, which is to try to allocate money on the basis of where improvements are seen. So we're going to probably pursue that again in the next Congress.
Thank you, Don. Anyone else? Joel, Don, Molly, anything else you want to add today? I think we're going to wrap it up here, unless not. Okay. Thanks everyone for attending. Really great discussion. Oh.
I just wanted to mention, if you have maybe Don, you were going to say this, but yeah, I know we want to be respectful of everybody's time. If you do have questions that we didn't get to, we'll try to follow up with you after the fact, and also feel free to reach out to our team. You'll get a follow-up email. I just want to make sure that everybody feels like you can get your question answered if you have one, and even if we couldn't get to it today.
Yes, exactly. Second that, and please follow with me, and you will be getting a follow-up email from me with a link to the recording. And with that, thanks everyone for joining, and have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all. Happy holidays.